Welcome to Pontefract, one of the most historically fascinating towns in Yorkshire. Once upon a time, Pontefract was one of the most powerful market towns in England, famed as the home of one of the most fearsome castles in the entire country, home to a long history of sweets and liquorice, and according to legend, closely linked with the famous outlaw Robin Hood. Pontefract's heritage extends even further than that, with the legacy of Roman settlement and the tale of some of the most vicious fighting in the English Civil War central to the town's history. And we'll explore all that and more over the course of our walk around town. But we start at the heart of town, on the marketplace, where we're looking up at Pontefract's Old Town Hall. The building dates from 1785, and it was designed to serve as an important facility in the centre of Pontefract, complete with an assembly room for the local council on the first floor, along with a space for the hosting of markets, and even a small jail on the ground floor in front of us here. But in the scope of Pontefract's lengthy history, the Old Town Hall is actually a fairly new building. Over 1,000 years ago in the Anglo-Saxon era, a small moot hall, or meeting hall, was built on this site at the centre of town, and it stood here for centuries. Sadly, the old moot hall met its end when it was destroyed by heavy fighting during the English Civil War of the 1640s. It was briefly replaced by a new town hall in the aftermath of the war, but it wasn't until the late 18th century that the building we know today was constructed. However, the old town hall today is named as such as in the late 19th century the council deemed the building insufficient for modern Pontefract, and so built a new town hall with assembly rooms in 1882, just a few steps away from here. Though no longer used for civic meetings, the old town hall is still the most prominent landmark in central Pontefract, overlooking the marketplace and bordered by this sloping street known as Gillygate. Once upon a time, Gillygate here was the main route into the centre of Pontefract from the south, leading towards St Giles Church, from which it takes its name. We'll visit St Giles, Pontefract's central church, in a moment, but let's now take a walk along the marketplace on this beautifully sunny morning. This pedestrianised street is lined with all manner of captivating buildings, including a number of pubs, such as the Liquorice Bush here. The pub is thought to date from the late 18th century, and its name pays tribute to Pontefract's long history of licorice production, which we'll talk about in detail a little later on. Looking across from the Liquorice Bush, there stands a magnificent Georgian-era townhouse, built in the mid-18th century. Today, this striking white building is a bank branch, and it has been since 1801. Before then, it was an impressive private residence, and before then, it was yet another central town pub, known as the Windmill Inn, which closed in 1776. And back across from the old Black Bull, there's yet another pub, the Red Lion, which is thought to be one of the very oldest inns in Pontefract. Though fronted with a splendid Georgian facade, the building dates to the 17th century. Now, as we'll see over the course of our walk, pubs are a major fixture of Pontefract's town centre, and it's often said that the town is home to the highest density of pubs per square mile in the UK. That might not quite be true, as many other towns lay claim to a similar title, but there's certainly no shortage of places to drink here in Pontefract. Here, meanwhile, we're looking up at one of the most important non-pub buildings in town, the huge Market Hall, which dates from the year 1860. The spectacular frontage of the building hides behind it an expansive network of market stalls that operate all year round, and have done for the best part of 700 years. Markets have been held on the site of the current market hall since the 14th century, and historically, the point where we're standing here was the site of the shambles, where fresh meat was sold. Nowadays things are a little different, with most market activity taking place inside the covered hall, although on Wednesdays, Fridays and Saturdays, a few more stalls are erected along the marketplace here, as we can see today. As we mentioned at the start of our walk, Pontefract was once upon a time one of the most powerful market towns in England, a status that came hand in hand with its important castle, which we'll visit later. Originally, the town was centred around Pontefract Castle, but from the 16th century onwards, it began to shift towards the marketplace here, which became the thriving commercial centre of Pontefract for centuries to come. Here, we find ourselves before two of the most important buildings in Pontefract's busy town centre, St Giles Church on the right, and the historic Buttercross on the left. The Buttercross dates from 1734, and as its name suggests, the Buttercross was built as a shelter for market traders selling dairy produce. But long before it was the site of dairy stalls in Pontefract's market, this was where one of the oldest structures in Pontefract stood, St Oswald's Cross, erected centuries ago in memory of the 7th century St Oswald. Historically, there was an area of unpaved ground which extended a couple of yards out from St Oswald's Cross, and it's said that this area was a place of sanctuary, where people evading arrest for debt and other offences could be safe. Now just beside the grand modern Buttercross, there stands the mighty St Giles Church, the modern-day parish church of Pontefract. The St Giles that we know today dates mostly from the 18th century, when it was heavily rebuilt after being deemed the new parish church of Pontefract, replacing All Saints' Church, which was bombarded to near destruction in the English Civil War. But the church here has a much longer history than the building we see today, with St Giles thought to have originally been founded in the early 12th century, growing in stature as the town of Pontefract came to be more heavily focused on this area. Sitting on the town's wide open marketplace, we'll pass back by this area once again in a short while. But just opposite the church, you'll find one of the narrowest alleyways in Pontefract. Ducks and Green Peas Row here is only short, but it tells us of one of Pontefract's most famous figures of the 18th century, a man named John Lund, who lived nearby and worked as a local barber, wig maker, and occasional political satirist. And the alleyway here is named after his most famous work of satire, Ducks and Green Peas. Lund lived for a long time on Beast Fair, the street that we now find ourselves on, and which is also home to the ever-popular town pub, the Beast Fair Vaults. The Beast Fair Vaults dates back to 1832, and it's had a number of different names over time, once also called the Boards Vaults and Muscroft's Vaults, while it's also had a variety of different nicknames given to it by its patrons. Now the Beast Fair Vaults of course takes its name from the street here, Beast Fair, which you won't be surprised to hear was once the site of Pontefract's huge cattle market. In the 19th century, meanwhile, Beast Fair was the place where many saddlers worked in town, making saddles for horses, although this industry gradually died out as cars became more widespread. Beast Fair leads us on to Corn Market here, which is home to, you guessed it, yet more pubs, like the Malt Shovel, which has been in operation as a pub since at least the mid-19th century, although it's reputed to have underground cellars that date all the way back to the 14th century, and that there may even have once been a tunnel running underneath the town centre from here towards the castle. Who knows whether that's true or not, but on this alleyway, known as Swale's Yard, that runs beside the Malt Shovel pub, we'll find what is undoubtedly one of the oldest buildings in Pontefract today. This is the Merchant's Warehouse, an impressive half-timbered building that was built from the 15th to the 17th century. As the name suggests, the building was the domain of a merchant in town, this warehouse just one part of what was once a larger dwelling altogether. Long ago, the building was also of such importance that Pontefract's market bell, which sounded to mark the opening of a market in town, hung from its walls. As recently as 10 years ago, the old merchant's house was used as a pub, known as the Counting House, though since its closure, the building has been unused, and it's an often overlooked landmark in the town centre, as it's set back from the main roads by this alleyway. But as we walk out of Swale's Yard, we once again find ourselves on the spacious Beast Fair and Corn Market, the latter of which was of course the place where corn, cereal, and other grains were traded. Nowadays, It's a pleasantly calm area of the town centre, a short walk away from the marketplace. And at the centre of the corn market here, there stands this large monument, a war memorial unveiled in 1923 that stands in memory of the locals who lost their lives in the First and Second World Wars. Now, as well as having served as the site of the corn market, this road was historically the main route into central Pontefract from the west, along which cattle traders, sheep farmers and more would herd their livestock to then be sold just down the road on Beast Fair. The trade of sheep in particular was an important part of the local economy in medieval Pontefract, as like across much of England, wool was a highly valued commodity that was traded extensively, and the sale of wool here in Pontefract would attract people from all over the region to visit the town's market. But speaking of the wider region, we haven't yet taken a look at a map to see exactly where in England Pontefract is located. As you can see here, Pontefract lies in the southeastern corner of what is today known as West Yorkshire, located about 10 miles east of the county town of Wakefield and about 15 miles north of Doncaster. Now here, we're walking past the impressive former Pontefract Magistrates Court, a spectacular building that served as a local courthouse for over 2 centuries, from 1807 all the way until 2013. Since it closed, however, the old courthouse has been converted into an expansive antiques market, complete with a delightful cafe too. But just a short walk along Corn Market from the old courthouse, we find ourselves in an area that would excite anybody with a sweet tooth, looking towards the rear of Pontefract's own Haribo sweet factory, from a street named Liquorice Way. This might all seem a little bit Willy Wonka, but Pontefract is a town closely associated with the manufacture of sweets over centuries and centuries of history. Now Haribo, the German brand whose sweets you'll find in shops all over the world, has been producing popular confectionery at its factory here in Pontefract since the 1980s. But the company's first involvement in sweet production in the town here goes back a little further, when it bought a stake in one of the longest running sweet manufacturers in Pontefract's history, Dunhill's. In the year 1760, a local chemist and grower of licorice by the name of George Dunhill made a brand new invention, adding sugar to licorice, which he began selling as a non-medicinal lozenge. The sweets were an immediate hit, and within a few decades they were sold and produced in towns all over Yorkshire, but were always popularly known as Pontefract cakes. Pontefract cakes, or Pomfret cakes as their name is also pronounced, are said to be the oldest sweet in Britain, and are still produced in the same vein as centuries ago, with an image of Pontefract Castle stamped on them to signify their heritage. Famously, licorice was once grown in the ruins of Pontefract Castle, which we'll be taking a walk around later on. But as the success of sweet production in Pontefract grew, it was more than just Pontefract cakes that were made here. While most licorice factories in Pontefract are now closed, owing to a dramatic rise in the demand for the product as the popularity of sweets skyrocketed, there are still 2 large sweet factories in town, one being the Haribo factory and the other the Tangerine factory, although at its height there were as many as 13 separate licorice factories in this one town. We'll talk more about the rise and fall of licorice manufacture in Pontefract when we visit the castle later on, but the legacy of Pontefract's sweetest export still draws in visitors to this day. For now though, we're making our way back along Corn Market, which, like pretty much all of the streets in Pontefract, is lined with pubs. Here, just opposite the War Memorial, there are even 2 pubs standing next door to one another, the Green Dragon and the Ponte Tavern. The Green Dragon opened all the way back in 1777, and has been well maintained over its centuries of existence, with the pub taking its name from the dragon that was slain by St. George. Its next door neighbour likely dates from the same time, though this pub was for a long time known as the Blackamoor's Head. In recent years, however, that original name came to be deemed as inappropriate, and so the pub was renamed as the Ponte Tavern, after one of the many nicknames of this town. As well as Ponte, Pontefract is also often known by the tongue-in-cheek nickname Ponte Carlo, while the neighbouring town of Castleford is also jokingly referred to as Cas Vegas, though you sadly won't find any deluxe 5-star casinos in either town today. Now, we've made it back to the part of town that surrounds St Giles Church, and this street is named Shoe Market, which was lined with small cobblers' workshops as far back as the mid-13th century. Originally, before the many buildings of the Georgian era made the town centre denser, the market used to extend all the way from the old town hall where we started towards the old courthouse, with the livestock market, shoe market, butter market, corn market and more, all taking place in what must have been a particularly packed part of town. The building of the market hall and the eventual removal of the town centre livestock market made things a little calmer on Pontefract streets over time. But just a short walk from St Giles Church, there stands a building where you can learn more about what the town was like in the past. This is Pontefrack Museum, housed inside an old Carnegie library that was opened back in 1904. The library moved next door to a more modern building in 1975, and so this building was converted into a museum, which is today home to a varied range of exhibitions on the history of this town in a cosy indoor setting. Now the museum sits on a road known as Rattan Row, historically the street of Pontefract's salt merchants. Nowadays, Rattan Row is a busy shopping street that was rebuilt in 1957, complete with a rear entrance into the town's central market hall. Before the rebuilding of the street, however, there was a small lane running through here that was known by the rather lovely sounding name, Pudding Middens. Rather unfortunately, Pudding Middens was the place where offal was dumped by butchers who worked in the shambles, where the modern marketplace is today. Combined with the many aromas coming from the bustling marketplaces found all throughout central Pontefract, Pudding Middens must have been a particularly foul-smelling place. And just along from where the old offal dumping ground was, to our left, there's also another interestingly named street, known as Rattan Row, a common street name across Yorkshire, in the past used to refer to a run-down area of town likely infested with rats. Before this part of town was rebuilt with modern shops, this area was historically one of the poorer parts of Pontefract, located just a few steps away from the open space that we can see at the bottom end of Rattan Row, which is known as the Wool Market. As the name suggests, this is where that all-important wool was traded in Pontefract, and later on in history, there was a pub in the building in front of us here, known as the Windmill Inn, which had been trading for nearly 200 years until it recently closed down. Given all the historic pubs we've seen on our walk so far, and believe me there are still more to come, you could make an entire day out simply exploring the countless alehouses to be found in Pontefract. However, we've now made it back to the point where we started our walk, by the old town hall. But we've still got more to see, and will shortly make our way towards the ruins of the castle and the once mighty All Saints' Church. Before we do that, however, we'll take a trip back through the centuries to the earliest origins of Pontefract, and here we find an impressive column that commemorates an important moment in the town's history. Long ago in the medieval era, Pontefract was an important place in the world of the influential de Lacy family. This column depicts the role of one John de Lacy, Baron of Pontefract, in forcing the unpopular King John to sign the Magna Carta in the year 1215. Now this side of the column depicts the town's seal, which features an image of the old Pontefrack Castle. As well as famously appearing on Pontefract cakes, the castle was once one of the most significant military fortresses in the country, highly sought after by kings as the key to keeping control of northern England. As we pass by Pontefract's current and rather modest town hall of 1882, the old castle, which today lies in ruins, was built all the way back in the late 11th century by Ilbert de Lacy, a Norman nobleman who had arrived in England alongside William the Conqueror in 1066. And as we walk past the Horsevaults pub here, it was the Normans' invasion of England that proved a major development in the history of Pontefract, as their arrival here led to an event which is thought to have given rise to this town's name. Across the road from us, we can see a pub by the name of the Broken Bridge, and this is what the modern name Pontefract refers to deriving from the Latin words Pontus Fractus. Now there's no trace of the bridge in question today, but it's thought that it was an important point for crossing the nearby River Aire, and it existed just a few miles away from here in Ferrybridge. The bridge only came to be known as the Broken Bridge, however, after the arrival of the Normans in the local area, as their invading forces sought to crush any domestic rebellions to the new rule of William the Conqueror. This was during a period known as the Harrying of the North, but the people of the local area fought staunchly against the imposition of Norman rule, and they destroyed the bridge over the Aire so as to prevent the Normans from advancing further north to take control of York and other major towns in Yorkshire. Now, as we know, the rebellion was ultimately crushed, and the Normans did establish their own castle here in Pontefract. But what was the town like before it came to be known as Pontefract? Well, this town had already had a long history even before the arrival of the Normans. Nearly 2,000 years ago, Roman settlers moved through this area, building a road connecting their major settlements at York and Doncaster. Not all too much is known of the extent of the Roman settlement in the Pontefract area, but just a few years ago in 2017, an archaeological dig uncovered 30 Roman skeletons nearby, believed to have been farmers that lived in the area. As for whether the settlement was any larger, it's difficult to tell, but there soon emerged two separate villages in this area. What we know today as Pontefract was originally made up by two settlements called Tanshelf and Kirkby, which blossomed especially during the era of Viking rule over this part of England. Now, Kirkby was named by the Vikings, its name referring to a settlement with a church in Old Norse, while Tanshelf is thought to come from the Old English, meaning a shelf of land belonging to someone called Tada. Of the two villages, Tanshelf appears to have been the more significant, with a sizable population of around 100 people, and in the 10th century, it may even have been a regional capital, with a large meeting place located on the site of the current marketplace. The town later came to be known as Pontefract after the rebellion against the Normans, though you'll still see a reference to the old village of Tanshelf today, as one of the town's stations is actually named Pontefract Tanshelf. Having now made our way away from the heart of town, and what was likely the heart of old Tanshelf, we've been walking along the street known as Horsefair. Once upon a time, Pontefract's main markets were held on the marketplace and on Horsefair here, located in an opportune position between the centre of town and the castle. Markets later became too big to be held on this one street, and so they moved towards the area around St Giles Church, which was widened and opened up around the turn of the 13th century. Horsefair today is lined with a combination of large supermarkets, a few more pubs, and some modern tower blocks, while at the foot of the street here, there's an interesting little residential crescent known as Bricklegate Square, at the centre of which there stands an eye-catching sculpture. But despite all my research, I'm not exactly sure what the sculpture here is, so if you live in one of the houses here and see it out of your window every day, or if you know anything about the sculpture, do let me know. From here we're now going to walk onto Micklegate, which takes us from the busy surroundings of the town centre to a narrower and quieter area of town that leads towards the castle, which we'll reach in a minute or two. Now, as we've explored over the course of this tour, Pontefract is a town absolutely packed to the brim with history on every corner, and that's made it one of my favourite places to explore in all of Britain. But some of the history behind this town can't necessarily be seen on its streets, and so it's worth mentioning one often overlooked fact about Pontefract. Back in August of 1872, a by-election was held here, but it wasn't like any election that had come before it. The Pontefract by-election of 1872 was the first in the UK to be carried out with the use of a secret ballot, a pioneering system that is now used in polling stations in elections today. When it was first used, though, many thought that the secret ballot would actually lead to an entirely different result, with voters able to make their choices without any exterior pressures. That didn't prove the case, but what did happen was that the Pontefract election reduced the amount of post-election riots and disorder that were common at the time, as people were able to point fingers at who voted for whom. The groundbreaking election here in 1872 was a real success, and in true Pontefract style, the ballot box was sealed at the end of voting with a liquorice seal, and you can still see it at the Pontefrack Museum, which we passed earlier on. Now on the approach to the castle here, we're passing by a historic building that stands on the site of the old Barbican, the main gatehouse that guarded the gates of Pontefract Castle. After the castle was destroyed in the English Civil War, however, this building went into use as what's thought to have been the first debtors' prison in England, and it was later used to keep French prisoners of war during the Napoleonic Wars. But now, it's time for us to make our way past what was once the most heavily guarded point in medieval Pontefract, into the grounds of the town's historic castle. Free to enter and explore, Pontefract Castle is one of the best and most easily accessible ruined castles you can visit in the UK. And as we walk past the remains of the old castle keep, we'll now take a lap of the enthralling ruins of this famous fortress. As we mentioned earlier, the castle was first built around the year 1070 AD by Ilbert de Lacy, perched atop a prominent rock that served as a strategically significant stronghold as the Normans cemented their power over the recently conquered nation of England. But at that time, Pontefract Castle was simply a wooden fort, almost nothing compared to the awesome stone fortress that it would become. Such was the importance of this castle in the medieval era, King Edward I famously once said that he who holds Pontefract holds the key to the north, and he certainly wasn't wrong. Over just under 600 years of existence, this castle rose to become one of the most fearsome fortresses in the country, and as we can see from this painting of the castle in the early 17th century, it towered over the surrounding landscape with ominous towers and great walls that served as a real show of power. Fast forward to the 21st century, and Pontefract Castle stands in ruins, devastated by numerous sieges of the English Civil War, and the aftermath of the conflict, that we'll talk more about in a moment. But while some parts of the castle may just look like a big pile of rocks, it's fascinating to explore the events that once took place in this very spot. Here at the eastern end of the castle, the horseshoe-shaped stone remains we can see are the oldest in the castle grounds. These are the foundations of what was once St Clement's Chapel, which was built by Ilbert de Lacy in the late 11th century, over 900 years ago. The chapel was the first stone building in what was then the wooden fort, and it was later rebuilt to even greater stature under the reign of King Henry VII around 400 years later. Given its significance, many kings of England came to visit this castle during their reigns, but one king wasn't all too glad after an extended stay here in the late 14th century. That was Richard II, who had ruled England for 22 years, but was deposed by the forces of King Henry IV in 1399. After he was forced to abdicate the throne, Richard was initially allowed to live by Henry, although after a plot to overthrow Henry once again, Richard was imprisoned in the Tower of London, and then moved to Pontefract Castle here. According to legend, Richard II was then starved to death inside these very walls, although some say that he starved himself, or that he was perhaps even hacked to death by guards. Whatever the truth, Richard's certainly grisly death here in the year 1400 contributed significantly to Pontefract Castle's reputation as one of the most terrifying castles in medieval England. Now here, we're looking at what were once the old kitchens that served the castle, and you might notice that the stonework just in front of us is coloured slightly pink at the bottom, a result of the burning fires and ovens that were located there centuries ago. As one of the most important castles in England, Pontefract Castle was more than just militarily mighty, but also a luxurious residence that at its height was occupied by as many as 1,000 people. Just along from the old great kitchens, we're looking at the remains of more of the facilities that we used to cater to the many royals and nobles who stayed at the castle, these being the remains of the old bakehouse and brewhouse, which for centuries were always thronging with activity. Of course today, The only people here are visitors exploring the ruins of the castle. But how did Pontefract Castle end up in this state? Well, that takes us back to the 1640s and the English Civil War. At the outset of the war, Pontefract, like much of Yorkshire and northern England, sided with King Charles I and the Royalist cause, and given its famous military strength, this was a key stronghold for the Cavaliers. In late 1644, however, the castle came under siege for the first time by parliamentarian forces, continuing for about 3 months and causing considerable damage to the castle's defences. However, the Roundheads weren't successful in the siege, and briefly retreated before launching another siege shortly afterwards in 1645, which this time gave them victory, as the Royalist garrison here surrendered. For 3 years from 1645, the parliamentarians fiercely defended Pontefract Castle, but in 1648, a small band of Royalist troops managed to sneak into the castle and regain control of it. By January of 1649, the Royalists had effectively lost the Civil War after King Charles I was beheaded in London, but the men at Pontefract Castle decided to keep fighting, holding out as the final Royalist stronghold in England until they were finally defeated by a parliamentarian force led by Oliver Cromwell in March that year. In the immediate aftermath of the castle's final capture, it was ordered that the once great fortress of Pontefract Castle be totally demolished and levelled to the ground, although much of it did survive, with most stonework taken by locals to build new buildings elsewhere in town. But that wasn't the end of the castle's story, as here we're walking by a small garden that has a big history. As we mentioned earlier on in our walk, liquorice came to be grown in the grounds of the ruined Pontefract Castle, serving as the origin for this town's most famous food. In the 1720s, Dunhills, then a family chemists, hired out the castle as a place to grow liquorice. Now, liquorice typically doesn't grow too well in England, but Pontefract is one of the few places in the country with ground conducive to its cultivation. The town, and the castle in particular, sit atop a softer, deeper, sandy soil that allows liquorice plants to lay down their very long roots, which can extend as far as 4 feet into the ground. Of course, when Dunhills developed the idea of turning licorice into a sweet, production in Pontefract skyrocketed, but this newfound popularity was also the ultimate downfall of the local industry. Demand for Pontefract cakes was so strong that it actually led to a shortage in the crop, and it eventually became cheaper and more sustainable to import licorice from the Middle East, where it grows more plentifully. By the end of the 19th century, almost all of the licorice fields that had emerged in Pontefract were gone, and the final licorice harvest in this town, so famously associated with the product, took place in the 1970s. Though, as we've mentioned, sweet manufacturing and the popularity of Pontefract cakes remain to this day. Now, we've made our way out of the grounds of the enthralling Pontefract Castle, and we're now walking along Castle Garth towards the eastern edge of the town centre, where we'll find the equally impressive ruins of All Saints' Church, destroyed by shelling in the Civil War. We'll end our walk there in just under 5 minutes' time, but as we walk towards the ruined old parish church, there's another interesting story about Pontefract that you may not know. Though famously associated with Nottinghamshire and Sherwood Forest, the legendary outlaw Robin Hood is said to have also been active in the area around Wakefield, Pontefract, and particularly the nearby village of Wentbridge. Now, as with any medieval English legend, these stories are more likely fiction than fact, although Wentbridge, located about 4 miles to the south of here, is one of the only place names in some of the earliest tales of Robin Hood that can be confidently traced to a modern location in England. The reason for this is that, once upon a time, there was a huge forest that existed just to the south of the Pontefract area, famously a landscape in which Robin Hood was rather prolific, and it's thought that the stories of his activities around here are interwoven with some of the real-life tales of uprisings against King John by John de Lacy and others in Pontefract. So there's more to Robin Hood than merely his life in Sherwood Forest, although it's difficult to find any concrete evidence today of his time here in Pontefract. One thing we can see concrete evidence of, however, is the ancient settlement of Kirkby, which we mentioned alongside Tanshelf, was one of the villages that predated modern Pontefract. Here, we're walking past the stone foundations of an Anglo-Saxon church that served the village of Kirkby. The church was likely built well over 1,000 years ago, and although only occupying a small footprint, it was once an important burial site, and also possibly the place where the native King Edred of the English based his military campaigns against the marauding Vikings in the 10th century. The ancient ruins of the Kirkby Church are just some of the countless fascinating historical landmarks that you'll find in this town, and I hope you'll agree, as we've toured the town centre, that Pontefract is a fantastically underrated cradle of English history. And in a town so full of history, where better to finish than the magnificent ruins of the old parish church of Pontefract. This is All Saints' Church, which was originally built in the 14th and 15th centuries as the grand parish church of the rapidly booming medieval town. Originally, the church wasn't quite as big as we see it today, with the octagonal tower on top of the building actually added in the 18th century. Of course, while All Saints was once the premier place of worship in town, the English Civil War had a devastating impact on this church. But despite that, All Saints' Church is, rather surprisingly, still alive and well, as it's home to an unusual new church within a church, a smaller structure that was built in 1967 among the ruined exterior. By this point, the status of Pontefract's parish church had been transferred to St Giles in the town centre, but with a working church and its centuries-old ruins, All Saints here is still the most spectacular. In the Civil War, the church, like the castle, was initially controlled by the Royalists, but it was targeted heavily during the First Parliamentarian Siege in 1644 and 45. The worst assault coming as over £1,000 worth of cannonball fire was launched within one day towards the building from nearby Monk Hill. After the Parliamentarians eventually took control of the church, it was stripped of most of its materials, with the roof removed. A spectacular monument that tells us of the historic grandeur of the town of Pontefract and its captivating warring history, this is the perfect place to bring an end to our walk around this enthralling market town. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're now looking forward to visiting Pontefract for yourself in future too.